Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very kind. I've actually spent quite a bit of time at this temple because about 3 years ago when we were forming the Buddhist Council, the temple was very kind to let us use their facilities as we prepared the constitution and all those sorts of things. And I know Sol, and I know Rachel, and I know Jake and Cecilia, and I also know Ajahn Brahm. In fact, I saw Ajahn Brahm a couple of weeks ago, and I went down to your beautiful piece of retreat land there where your monks are staying, and you very kindly showed me around and showed me his own personal space there, which is always an honour to meet a meditator who then shows you his own personal space. That's really a great honour. So I thank them very much for that. There's lots of things I could talk about tonight. Last time I was here, I talked a little bit about the Kamakaji lineage because that's pretty much what I'm representing. Even though from the Diamond Way Buddhist Centre, which has 550 centres around the world, so it's a reasonably large organisation. We are part of the Kamakaji school, and the Kamakaji school, as some of you may know, is a branch, one of the 4 main branches of Tibetan Buddhism. We don't actually call it Tibetan Buddhism anymore because we're not living in Tibet, and I don't speak Tibetan, and most of the people I know don't speak Tibetan. But we're very lucky that at a particular time in history when things went pear-shaped in India, that all of the Buddha's amazing teachings were able to be transmitted to the Tibetan people who were the holders of those teachings for a very long period of time, until unfortunately, as most of you know, things went pear-shaped for them with the Chinese invasion in the 50s and the 60s. So we were very lucky that they had those transmissions and teachings. And of course, when the Tibetans had to flee from their homeland and find refuge in places like India, they came in touch with Western people and other people who were very interested in these types of teachings. And so they, at that time, didn't know if they were actually going to survive as a group of people. Many of them were very ill with tuberculosis and other diseases which they picked up when they came down to the lowlands of India. So they were very keen to share their teachings at that time in case it literally died out with them. So there is a stream of transmission, we could say, which dates back to the time of the Buddha, then was carried through India until the decimation of Buddhism in India, when the Muslim hordes came through and wiped it out pretty much, which then was transmitted up into Tibet, and now within the last 40 years onwards to people like myself. I've been very fortunate. I've actually had some Tibetan teachers and also some Western teachers. I mean, my own main teacher, Lama Role, met with the Tibetans back in 68, 69 in Nepal. But for myself, I've also had quite a bit of contact with the Tibetans. So tonight I thought I would talk a little bit around about the idea of Diamond Way, or what Vajrayana Buddhism is, because as I said, the last time I was here, I talked somewhat about this transmission lineage, and I explained to the people that were here what transmission meant and what the Kamakaji lineage of transmission was. And I thought I would just elaborate on that a little bit this time. Kamakaji Buddhism is more than 1,000 years old as a transmission lineage. That means that for more than 1,000 years, in an unbroken chain of master-disciple, the teachings that originated at the time of the Buddha and also post-Buddha, which were considered useful, have been transmitted down. There are different levels of transmission there. Of course, there's the normal teachings which many people come into access with, monk and nun with the Vinaya, Abhidhamma, teachings on the way that the world is put together and the way that it functions, according to Buddhist view, Sutra, as we call them. And each of those different levels of teachings fits a particular function. For us in the Diamond Way, we're mainly working with a particular type of philosophy, from the middle way it's called, and I'll explain that a little bit more. We're working with a view that equates to what we often call as Buddha's third turning of the wheel, where he talked about Buddha nature, and the type of meditation that we're working with can be reasonably varied, but when I talk about it a bit tonight, I'm sure that many of you will know exactly what I'm talking about, although you might use a slightly different style of meditation. We've actually shared something tonight which is common across all of Buddhism. So we normally put these types of teachings into three baskets. We call it view, conduct and meditation, and this is what has been transmitted down. The view, of course, for us is that all beings contain the Buddha nature. That means that all beings with a conscious mind, what that is in somewhat debate sometimes, but we would say that the beings with a conscious mind have a potential for Buddhahood. Doesn't mean that they'll all reach it necessarily, but they have that potential there. So we're working with this idea that within a being, let's say a human being, there is the potential for them to become a Buddha. That would be the view. Then the conduct, or the way that we behave in the world, is the way that we express that view. And once again, as in all the Buddha's teachings, there are different levels here. For example, we might work with cause and effect, so we might be working with a way of remembering how to behave in the world with our body, speech and mind, so that we're not harming others, and we're also not harming ourselves, of course, and that we're also supporting our journey by behaving in a way that's positive. Often at this level we talk about 10 positive or 10 negative actions. We talk about things that we do with our body and things that we don't do. For example, we don't take what's not given, we don't harm others sexually, we don't kill other human beings. With regard to the speech, we would not engage in telling lies, slandering them, divisive speech or gossiping about people. And the three that we consider very important, of course, are working with the mind, and this is not to covet the things that others have, not to wish them ill, and most importantly not to develop hatred and anger, because that, as Buddha said, is probably the worst poison of all, because it just burns up every good impression you've ever sown in your mind when you develop and give way to your hatred and anger. And for us it would be definitely not cutting off people. So what we mean by this is, it means that, of course, for most of us we're beginners on the path and we get angry. It happens. But what we must not do is we must not cut them off. It means that we must never say to ourselves, if this person came to me for help, no way ever will I help them. That's what we would mean by cutting off. Of course, one needs to apply wisdom across all of those things, because sometimes giving people what they ask is not always the most intelligent thing to do. You know, if you give someone with a drug habit who comes up to you and says, you know, give me $1,000, you're probably pretty sure that within the end of the day it's all gone. That may not be the best thing for them. So there's a type of intelligence or wisdom that needs to be applied across all of those things. So of course with those 10 things, then we would talk about doing the opposite to it. So instead of taking life, we would save life. Instead of harming others sexually, we would express it in a joyful way. Instead of telling lies, we'd tell the truth. Instead of slandering and gossiping and backbiting, we would use our speech in a way that brought people together in a positive way, yeah? Healed their wounds and made sure that they were working together in a good way. And of course, instead of coveting, you'd be happy when people have something that they're happy about. Yeah? That's a really positive thing. And of course, you would never wish others ill will. If someone came to you for help and you could do it in an intelligent way, then you would do it. So that's conduct at that sort of level that we're talking about. At another level of conduct, we would be working with what we call the param etas, or the actions that take us beyond the ordinary world, or actions that take us beyond suffering, if you like. And here we're talking about teachings particularly from the Bodhisattva path, which is what we would be using here. Practicing generosity of body, speech and mind. Of course, the most generous thing you can ever do for beings is give them an opportunity to work with their mind, which is what you've done here in this centre. This is a very positive thing. Yeah, you give somebody $10, they feed themselves for a meal or maybe for a day if it's somewhere else, but if you give them the Dharma, then you've given them a gift that lasts them forever. So we would say that there's different levels within generosity. Ethical behaviour is another one. Working in a very powerful, constant way. Some would call it diligence, putting constant effort into things. Practicing patience, incredibly virtuous thing that one can do. Buddha talked often about this, yeah. not being overwhelmed by other people's trips, but really developing a kind of tolerance within ourselves where we can work constantly and with them no matter what they throw at us. And then of course we have developing concentration through meditation, and the sixth paramita is actually transcendental wisdom. And it's not intelligence, it's wisdom that we can apply in every situation, that actually knows exactly what is needed in the moment in an intelligent way, a beyond way. So this is what we would say that bodhisattvas develop. If you don't know what a bodhisattva is, although I'm sure many of you have heard that word, a bodhisattva is the idea of a liberated being, a being that is working not just for the benefit of themselves, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. This is actually a really good definition. Then of course we have another level of working, and that is simply working with the mind. So this is a little bit more abstract, and it requires a special kind of relationship. It means that one has a relationship with a teacher that one can trust, because here things can get a little bit interesting. One has to rely less and less on firm ground and really sort of concrete ideas, and work more and more with the idea of someone who is already liberated or enlightened and is actually guiding you. And sometimes one's body, speech or mind might not always be very clear to the student at this level, and so they need to have a lot of trust or devotion, a lot of confidence in the teacher at this level in order to work with this type of teaching. So this is what I thought I would talk a little bit about tonight, this level, because it's very special to Vajrayana Buddhism. It's very important. It can be misunderstood. It could be abused if one was not with a competent teacher. So it's a very, very special thing that goes on. Buddha was an amazing person, and he also had amazing people around him. When you read the life stories of his students, they were extraordinary people. What a great honour to have a teacher like that. But obviously we're sitting here in this room tonight, and Buddha has passed away more than 2,500 years ago, so we're not actually with him at this moment. We are in spirit, but not in the flesh as such. So then we would say, well, how do we come in contact with Buddha? And so we would say then, well, actually Buddha was a person in that setting, that historical setting. But we have to remember the inner meaning of Buddha. Buddha means to awaken. Bud, to awaken, to wake up to one's own inner perfection, one's own Buddha nature, which, as I just said, all sentient beings contain. It's like the diamond covered with mud, or it's like a poor man sitting on a massive nugget of gold under his hut, but he doesn't even know it's there, and he's completely in poverty. You know, it's not even understanding that inner richness is there, ready to be discovered or found. So how do you do that? And those people 2,500 years ago had Buddha to do that for them. He was like a mirror. He was shining, he was radiant, he was fully enlightened, and he was saying, this is enlightenment. This is also possible for you, and I can show you the way to do that. And they had a lot of trust in, a lot of confidence in him, a lot of devotion in him, and those that were able to develop that obviously developed themselves very rapidly. As I said at the moment though, he's not sitting here. So for us, how do we come in contact with that Buddha nature? So here, this is why this concept of a teacher is so important in Vajrayana Buddhism, because we say that the Buddha is like a mirror to the mind. The teacher is there, shining, radiant and reflecting and showing us our potential for enlightenment. But the horrible thing is they're often also showing us all our warts and crow's feet and everything as well, and that's a really difficult thing to work with as well, because actually you have to have quite a level of maturity, don't you, in order to be able to face the good and the bad within yourself, and that's not always easy. We often say that Buddha had a lot of compassion for beings, but he wasn't looking for sheep, he wasn't looking for followers, he was looking for colleagues, he was looking for people that could see the potential that he developed also in themselves, and have a trust in that, and then work towards developing that Buddha nature within themselves. So here also, if the teacher is shining, sort of holding up the mirror of enlightenment to us, if we don't have a lot of strength or trust or devotion, then that can be a little bit overwhelming for us. Maybe we run away. Maybe we say things about them, oh, it's too much, or they do this or do that. But actually, if we're really honest with ourselves, then we sit down and we say, what's going on here? Okay, they're showing me some really positive things about myself, but I'm also seeing some quite negative things come up, and that's quite uncomfortable. So here, the basis of this relationship is maturity. It means that you have to have a maturity of development within yourself to be able to work with that aspect of yourself. And then we have to develop confidence, trust and devotion, this type of idea. And here we're talking about something that is not superficial. Lots of people say, oh, I've got confidence and I've got trust. But it's a type of childlike confidence or trust. And it's not based on anything concrete. And the moment that the teacher comes along and says, listen, it's not so good you're doing this, or it's not so good that you're doing that, or maybe you should try this or that. And because they're not a very stable person themselves, all their illusions are shattered, and they run away and have a cry, or they turn away from the teacher. And this can be a big problem. So this trust or this confidence is actually built on watching the teacher and checking them out, and making sure that what they do and they say is constant, and that they can walk their talk. This is very important, because you can never develop full trust and devotion or confidence in a person if they're not always doing those things, yeah? If they're changing like the wind all the time. So this is why it's such a difficult relationship to develop. It's because it's not easy to find people like that. You know, it's very, very hard to find people who are really very well spiritually developed. Probably the greatest person you'll ever meet in your life would be someone like that. Someone that you could really develop that type of trust and confidence in. Because when you meet a person like that, and they say to you, yes, I will work with you, that's an enormous gift, but it's also an enormous responsibility. It's a big responsibility for the teacher, because they're taking you under their wing and they're saying to you, yeah, I'll look after you, I'll help you. But it's not all smooth sailing. You know, there's going to be times when we're going to have to work with each other, and you're going to have to trust what I'm saying to you. And you're going to have to be mature enough to take on what I'm saying to you as well. So it's a kind of special thing, yeah? It's really a special thing. I mean, many people wouldn't really be comfortable with coming to Buddhism because lots of people actually want someone to tell them what to do. But we're not like that. Buddhism is not like that. Some would say that Buddhism is a religion, but you know, if you really look at the definition of religion, it doesn't really fit into that. You know, and some might say it's a psychology, but yeah, there's aspects of psychology in there, but it's not really a psychology either. You know, we don't stand on the street in Perth with funny clipboards and odd questionnaires trying to pull people in, or you know, we're not running around proselytising and trying to convert everybody. What we're doing here is we're keeping the style that Buddha himself gave us 2,500 years ago, and that is that we're looking for people who want to work with their minds and develop themselves in a mature way. So it's not an easy thing. So this is pretty much the basic concept of working with a teacher. This is what I wanted to say to you, and it's one of the central concepts within the Vajrayana. So it's not always easy to meet with those people, and when you meet with them and you do develop a relationship with them, it's an amazing thing. It really is. So myself, I've been very fortunate because over the years I've met many fine people within the Dharma setting, but also within the School of Buddhism that I'm working with. I've been very fortunate. For ourselves, as I said in the talk a couple of years ago, we have this lineage, and it's called the oral transmission lineage, because the key teachings, the really profound ones, were always only ever handed down from master to student by talking, speech, by explanation. They weren't written down as such. And this is an interesting point, because scholars will often say, oh, if it's not written down, didn't exist, never happened. But, you know, I'm sorry, it's not actually like that. Just because something hasn't been written down doesn't mean that it's not in existence, it just means that they don't know about it. So, of course, many teachings were only ever transmitted to teacher and student, and maybe only from the teacher to one student, who was their principal student, in an oral transmission. I wanted to say that to you because it's very interesting. Sometimes, you know, there's lots of books published on Buddhism these days. You can buy everything off the internet, Amazon.com, it's wonderful. But it's very interesting to read some of these scholarly texts. We had a very famous example. There was a guy called Waddell, and he was a Christian missionary who went to Tibet in the 18th century, I think it was. And he wrote a very famous book called The Lamism of Tibet. And of course he completely bagged it, because he went up there and he was a Christian missionary, and he said that they were following around and worshipping these guys, and wasn't very complimentary at all. But of course the gentleman was seeing it from his own point of view as a Christian missionary, and he didn't, you know, as an observer from the outside looking in, and he didn't really understand what was going on. So that's why I'm saying to you, Mr. Waddell's experience was from the scientific looking glass, from the outside looking in. But actually, in order to really understand something, you have to experience it, don't you? You have to be in it, you have to develop the relationship, you have to be part of something in order to really understand how it functions. So, in this Tibetan lineage, we had these fellows. The first one was called Tilopa, more than 1,000 years ago, who was a yogi, a wild-looking gentleman, probably running around with a single loincloth on and his hair up in a top knot, wearing all the bone ornaments of a yogi and living in cremation grounds and under trees and simply wandering around. That was his style. His student Naropa was actually a monk who was one of the gatekeepers of the Nalanda University, a very, very famous institute in India. And it said that he was one of the sharpest minds in the country of the time, because at the Nalanda University there were 4 gates. And the gatekeepers were the people that would debate with anybody that came to the gate. And of course the tradition in those days in India was, if you had to debate with someone and they beat you, you had to become their student. So in Nalanda, our Buddhist forefathers chose some very sharp people to sit on the gate, because they weren't too keen about the people coming along converting everyone. So Naropa himself decided that actually, at this particular time, what he had wasn't working for him. And so he heard the name of this guy called Tilopa and went off and sought him, who became his student, and then spent quite some years, 12 years with him, undergoing 12 major and 24 minor, well, you could call them tragedies if you wanted to, or experiences where his trust, confidence and devotion in the teacher was sorely tested. But at the end of it, he was very fortunate, because it said that he developed full enlightenment. His student was actually a chap that came down from Tibet called Mapa, a very interesting boy, because in those days there were 2 occupations in the part of Tibet he lived in. You either became a lama or you became a robber. Or a farmer, I guess, maybe, but his parents were farmers, and this boy was so wild that they couldn't do anything with him. So they didn't want him to become a robber, so they suggested he became a lama. And he travelled down to India and spent many, many years in India, and actually became a student of Naropa, collected many teachings from him and other great Indian masters, and then took them back to Tibet. He's very famous in Tibet. He's known as Mapa Lotsawa. He was a very famous translator, and he translated many of the teachings from Indian, from Sanskrit, into Tibetan at that time. Mapa's main student was a guy called Milarepa, probably Tibet's most famous yogi. You might have heard of him. Milarepa started his illustrious career as a great spiritual being as a murderer, which gives us all hope, I suppose. His family was quite wealthy, but his father died when he was young, and his auntie and uncle dispossessed his mother and himself and his sister of all their lands, all their goods and everything, turned them into servants. And his mother was so incensed and so angry at this that she actually sent him off to learn black magic, which was quite prevalent at the time. And somehow he gained this ability to make some sort of hallucination appear. And while his auntie and uncle were hosting a wedding, he managed to make some sort of hallucination appear in the house that frightened the animals in the stable underneath. And because in a Tibetan house, all the animals live underneath the house whilst the humans live above, they pulled against the pillars of the house and the whole thing collapsed. 35 people died. It wasn't just a murder, he was a mass murderer. Terrible. And he was so mortified, so terrified at what he'd done, thinking, I'm going to hell, I'm going straight to the hell realms, that someone said, you better go and find a good lama, a good teacher, and try and get yourself out of this. And he heard the name of this guy called Marpa. So he went to see Marpa, and Marpa said, wow, what have you done? You're in trouble. And then said about, well, he sort of accepted him as his student, but set him some very, very difficult trials. And the whole idea of those trials was actually to try and cleanse some of this negative karma that he'd accrued. And it took him quite some time to do that. But interestingly, he'd had enormous trust in Marpa. I mean, I guess the guy thought, I'm going to hell, so I better really trust what's going on with this guy here. And he developed intense devotion and great trust in Marpa. And actually Marpa saw great potential in him and gave him the teachings and then sent him away to the mountains. And you might have heard of Milarepa. He lived in the mountains by himself for many, many years and specialised in a particular yogic practice called Tumo. And Tumo is the inner heat practice where the yogis can take the energy of their body and bring it into the central channel, which is a special tantric teaching, and they use it as a focal point for meditation. But the byproduct of it is that they generate heat, bodily heat, and it's what keeps them alive, and they can live in the snow, in the freezing weather. And I tell you, that practice is still alive and kicking today. You can go and find them. They still practice that. And the way that they test it these days is normally they'll go out in the middle of winter on a freezing cold night and they'll sit naked in the snow and they'll be wrapped with a cold wet sheet, and then they have a competition to see who can dry the most sheets that night. I tell you, it still happens to this day. I've met these guys. So anyway, Milarepa was very famous for this practice of this Tumo, and actually it said that he's amazing in Tibet. They love him because he went from this terrible, terrible past to full enlightenment within one lifetime using the Buddha's teachings. So as I said, no matter how bad you might think you are, remember the word Milarepa and say, yep, there's some hope there. And that's why Tibetans love him, yeah. So from Milarepa, then he had a number of very fine students, but the main one was a guy called Gampopa, who was a famous doctor, and he was also a monk, and he came to Milarepa and took the teachings from Milarepa, and actually he established the monastic tradition within the Kagyu tradition. So he went away and established quite a few monasteries, and once again was a very famous teacher in Tibet, and he had quite a few disciples himself, and from there the tradition branches out. Where does it go to from there? Right throughout the Himalayas, actually. Northeastern India, northwestern India, Tibet, until it was decimated, Bhutan, so right across the Himalaya there. So where do we get to today? Well, actually we have a teacher called the Karmapa in charge. Karmapa is often known as the first incarnate Lama of Tibet. The first one appeared, and he was a student of Gampopa, the monk that I just talked about, and he was actually predicted by Buddha, and you can find his name in a number of the different sutras from the Mahayana tradition. Samadhi Raja Sutra is the main one that you find him in, where Buddha talks about this gentleman who will appear with a crown of light above his head, and he'll be known as Karmapa, and he's a great bodhisattva who appears in the world to benefit countless beings. So now we have 17 Karmapas, so one after the other they have consciously taken rebirth in Tibet, which is an interesting subject in itself, until this present day when we have the present Karmapa, Thaya Dorje. And how do I know him? Well, because actually I was one of his tutors. In 1999 I went to live with him in northeast India in Kalimpong, which is up near Darjeeling, and I went to tutor him in maths, science and English, and I lived with him for a year and a half. We managed to get him out of Tibet when he was about 13 years of age from underneath the nose of the communist Chinese, And eventually we actually got his mother and his father and his brother out as well. So we're very fortunate. And then Karmapa came to live in Delhi, and then he went to live in Kalimpong, where the 16th Karmapa had actually had a beautiful house donated to him by a sponsor at that time, back in the 1970s, I think. So in Kalimpong there was already this house here, so Karmapa lives there, and he still lives there to this day. And so the history of the Karmapas is interwoven with the Karmakadra tradition. They were the teachers of the Emperor of China, or Emperors of China. That is where the black crown came from, because one of the emperors of China recognised this ability of the Karmapa as a bodhisattva, and had a replica crown made for him so that he could wear it in public. So if you ever see those pictures of Karmapa and this black crown, it actually dates back to, I think, the 5th emperor of China or something like that. So he had this crown made for him. So they were the tutors and the teachers of the emperors of China, and also the famous Mongol emperors, Kublai Khan, I think, and who's the other famous one? Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, very famous, interesting gentleman. So then they have been the holders of the transmission of those teachings themselves. Most of the Karmapas have been monks and lived in monasteries. A couple of them weren't, but most of them have been in their different incarnations. The current one is. And as I said to you, he lives in Kalimpong, but also he travels around the world at the moment. So we have this transmission of teachings which has travelled down through the ages from the time of Buddha, been brought together around about 1100 years ago, and then transmitted on from master to student in an unbroken line across that time period. This is a very important point. This is why I'm actually telling it to you, because it means that the transmission has been carried through. Nothing has been lost. And what are we transmitting here? Is it just dry, dusty teachings, or is it just a bunch of text or something? Actually, what we're talking about is realization. This is the most important thing. The thing that Buddha gave to his students was the ability to recognize Buddha within themselves, to become enlightened. And what we're talking about here is that the teacher is transmitting to the student their experience. And by experience, what do I mean? Well, I actually mean their experience of the nature of mind, that their own Buddha nature. This is something very, very special, because one cannot use words and concepts to explain something that goes beyond words and concepts. One cannot even give it to somebody. But what they can do is lead them to a point where they can share that experience, and then, having tasted it, if you like, go on to develop that fully within themselves. This is actually what we mean by transmission. So this is the most important thing that we have within our lineage for ourselves, this idea that if you want to use the idea of a candle that's lit and being, you light the next candle and the next candle and the next candle, something is flowing, something is moving there. It's the experience of the nature of mind. Can you say it's the same in everybody? Can you say it's different? Actually, I'm not going to say anything at all. One has to experience that for themselves. But what the teacher does is one gives one the opportunity to experience or discover that within themselves. And that's ultimately my point. That's why one needs a teacher who has the experience. How do they gain it? Through meditation. Meditation is Buddha's gift to people. This is the thing that we have across all our Buddhist traditions, which is so special. The fact that we can sit down and work with our minds. If it were just concentration, then really good sports people would actually have that, because the ability to concentrate is not just special to people like ourselves who meditate, but what is special is the ability to take the ability to concentrate and then use it to discover our inner richness. That's really what we're talking about. That's the important thing here. So we go on a journey, and we use meditation as a profound tool to discover our inner richness. And then we have a teacher that supports us on that journey. They guide us. They help us through the highs and lows of the journey. We have friends around us, the Sangha as well. We have ordained Sangha, and then we have the other members of the Sangha, people, lay Sangha, who act as our friends and support us on the way as well. So actually the whole journey is about lots and lots of people coming together to support us in our practice. But in Vajrayana, as I said, the most important is the teacher, the person who has the experience of Buddha nature, who has experienced the radiance of their own mind, and then from that experience can transmit it on to the student. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, and if you've got any questions, I would welcome them. I'll do my best to give you a half-intelligent answer. The view. It's very nice from where I'm sitting. Well, actually within the Buddha's teachings, as we would talk about it, there's a number of different ways of explaining enlightenment or seeing enlightenment. And actually different Buddhist schools have slightly different ways of seeing it. Of course, the ultimate is that all beings have the potential to attain to Buddhahood, if one is following that idea. After Buddha passed away, there were different attempts at trying to understand what he was expressing. And from a philosophical point of view, we often talk about four main schools of philosophy within Buddhism. Vaibhashika, Sautantrika, Chittamatra, which is the mind-only school, and then the Madhyamika, or Madhyamaka, it's the same thing. And each of them is a way that the people that followed Buddha were trying to explain what he was saying. If you remember your atomic theory from school, that things are composed of atoms, then actually, and our scientists still work with that view, that is actually one of the philosophical views that arose after Buddha appeared, yeah? The Vaibhashikas said that ultimately everything is composed of a particle, and you cut the particles down, until you get to a particle that can't be divided anymore. But of course there was a complete hole in their argument, you know. At what point do you stop dividing it? Where's the front and where's the back? So then another group of people came along, the Sautantrikas, who said, no, there's a flaw in your argument there. And actually this is a beautiful thing about Buddhism. We don't need to have wars. We haven't had wars about I'm right and you're wrong. What they had was debates. And they worked with the teachings of Buddha and then developed it. So then the next lot of guys that came along said, well, that's not quite right. And actually then they talked about a view that there wasn't this partless particle, that you could divide everything down to momentary experiences. But of course the whole in that article is that at what point does the experience stop and when does it start? So then the next lot of guys that came along, and it didn't necessarily happen chronologically. You can imagine that these debates are going on across the centuries. Somebody says it's like this, and then some centuries later says, no, it's like that, and they refute it. The mind-only school developed. And here they took the teaching that Buddha said everything is just mind. And they worked with the idea that everything that we experience, all of our perceptions, our feelings, the inner world and the outer world are based on our mind. They're an expression of our mind, that our own mind creates all of that. And here there's quite an advance, actually. You won't find this in science. But the problem of this view was that they said everything is just mind, and then they made mind into a thing. And of course Buddha said to us, it's not a thing. There's no colour, no weight, no smell. You can't find it, you can't touch it. It's not a concrete thing, the mind. And yet there is something there that experiences, that knows, that is radiant and is aware. So from this, the highest philosophical view that we would work with, the Madhyamika says everything is empty, the self is empty. If you look for a self, you can't find it, yeah? Where are your thoughts, where are your feelings, where are your ideas? If you look for a self, ultimately it dissolves away into nothing, there's nothing there. And if you look at phenomena, and you break them down, ultimately there's nothing there. You go down to the atom, then we know that the atom is, our scientists tell us, it's broken into smaller and smaller particles with more and more space between them, and ultimately you say, well, where does it finish? Everything dissolves back into space. But this is too much for people, yeah? That freaks them out, because they say, well, if it's all space, there's nothing there, and I don't exist, and that's nihilistic. And of course, Buddha's view is never nihilistic. It's actually rich and powerful. But what he was saying was, the world that you experience is different from the way that you think it is. Based on your senses, it's different. Based on your thoughts and feelings, it's different to that. So then here one really needs to check it out and investigate. This is the powerful teaching that Buddha gave us here. Check things out. So the view that we're working with, this highest view, is the emptiness of things, yeah? This is what we're talking about. That the self is empty and that phenomena are also empty. And there's a lot of books written about that stuff.
Any other questions? Did you want to? Yes, one at the back.
I was just wondering if you might say something about the way that new lamas and Dalai lamas are never found. Just the process that
Sure.
goes on across the line.
Sure. Theoretically, for example, the Dalai Lama, I mean, everybody knows him, yeah, or knows of him. He's quite a famous person. And if you've ever seen the film Kundun, I think it was, yeah, it talks about his life in Tibet and how he's discovered. One of the qualities that one develops out of meditation, particularly deep shamatha meditation, calming the mind, is a type of clairvoyance. There's no doubt that it's there. The ability to know the minds of others, the ability to see what is going on in places away from where one is. There's no doubt about it, that quality exists. And there's no doubt that those who meditate deeply and well can develop that quality. So from this quality of knowing, they're able to see where, if you like, a mind is taking rebirth, in this case. They call them tulkus in Tibetan, illusory body, tulku, illusory body. And there's two different types of them though. There's tulkus that are found that are just like you and I, ordinary people, but they end up in positions of importance. In Tibet, the system was often manipulated so that families who had done a lot for particular groups or monasteries or whatever, a child might be found in their family who was a tulku as a kind of reward to the family because it gave them a lot of honour and status within the community. So that's one kind. Then you have beings like the Karmapas and Dalai Lamas, and these are considered to be the rebirths of bodhisattvas. So a bodhisattva is a being who has seen through the illusion of a self. So on the first bodhisattva level, you no longer hold on to the view. You've seen through the illusion of a self. You're no longer fettered by that illusion. The first bodhisattva level is called joyous because you're just so happy to see through that whole game. And then as one of the qualities of a mind that's achieved that level of understanding, they're able to direct their consciousness in their inner rebirth. And they'll direct it to where it will most benefit beings. And this is the idea behind Karmapas and Dalai Lamas, that they come back, if you like, or they come to places where they'll be of most benefit, and they do it consciously. The rest of us, we're blind by the winds of karma. We take bodies depending on what store impressions we have within our mind stream. But for those beings who have seen through the illusion of a self, they're able to direct their consciousness. So that's the idea. And that's the process that hopefully someone who has that level of understanding or clairvoyance will be able to find them, if you like. Myself, I've met many tulkus. As I said to you, I was working with one of them, you know, probably the greatest of our tradition, a real honour. They do have special qualities, there's no doubt about them. I've seen some very unusual things in some small children which really kind of make you wonder what your high school education was all about. You know, there's something going on there that's beyond the normal. They do things which are very, very unusual for children. Yeah. I mean, in our culture we'd say they were child prodigies, yeah? If they weren't in a spiritual setting. But there's something going on there, that they have a sense of knowing, understanding, the ability to do things at incredibly young ages, all sorts of things. So, I hope, does that answer your question? Is that?
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering too, if those people were found by other people that know about them too, would they still develop in the same way?
That's a really good question. Would they develop in some way? No, because they wouldn't be brought into that particular circumstance, but they would probably be of use to humanity in some way. Although it's also said that if they take a rebirth and it's not favourable, often they die quite young and take rebirth again in a circumstance where they can be working in the way that they want to be. It's a very unusual concept, isn't it? This idea of taking a body and making it happen where you want it to happen. It's very unusual. What will happen next? Well, I don't know, because really it's a system that came into great prominence in Tibet. I mean, we don't hear much about it from the great masters of India, and there's no doubt that many of them, after the Buddha, you know, through the history of India, were great beings that were coming back to make sure that the stream of Buddha's teachings was continuing on, yeah? And not just in India, of course. But in Tibet it became quite a special thing for them. Now, of course, the communist Chinese are involved in it very heavily. And to be honest with you, I think it's a system that's probably outlived its time. I think the bodhisattvas will, and beings that can direct their minds, will find better systems to work in than that. Yeah.
Stuart, could I just ask a question on a completely different topic?
Sure.
The President of the Buddhist Council. I have a feeling that some people here may have no idea what that is.
Oh, right.
And as the SWA is a member of the Buddhist Council, could you just give us a very brief description of what it is and why it's
Sure.
relevant to the people in this room?
Sure, my pleasure. Well, the Buddhist Council was formed about 3 years ago, so it's quite a young body. At the moment there are 9 Buddhist organisations in Perth that are members of it, Your Own Temple being one of them. We comprise the Theravada tradition, Mahayana tradition, Vajrayana tradition. We're all in there working together. We have a committee, president, vice president, and Your Own Jake is the vice president at the moment, treasurer secretary, and then we have and each centre has its own representative on the council. Our main job is to promote Buddhism within Western Australia, and we are also a member of the Federation of Australian Buddhist Councils, so we also work nationally as well. So our main job, our mandate is not to interfere in the affairs of temples. Our mandate is to work for the betterment of Buddhism within WA by meeting with local government, state government, helping temples if they have problems with local government. We've had a few where they've had trouble with the planning department. We've stepped in and given them help there. Just generally promoting Buddhism across the state. That's our main goal. So, as I said, we're in fairly early stages now, but we're trying to really step things up and become well known, particularly to the politicians, to make sure that the Buddhist temples and the Buddhists of this state receive a fair go and a fair hearing.